In the heart of Willow Creek, where the mornings were often painted in soft gold and the sidewalks buzzed with familiar hellos, there stood a modest place called Maplewood Diner. It wasn't just a spot for pancakes and coffee. It was the town's living room, where stories were swapped like heirlooms and every face had a name. Among all the people who passed through its doors, one bond quietly outshone the rest. The friendship between Mason, a warm-hearted server in his early 30s, and Grace, an 80-year-old veteran with silver hair and a stubborn sparkle in her eye. To Mason, Grace wasn't just another regular who liked her bacon extra crispy and her coffee black. She was the steady morning presence that made the diner feel more like home. Every sunrise shift, he'd watch for her slow but steady walk across the street, her cane tapping out a familiar rhythm, her smile lifting his tired spirits before the clock even struck 7. But that Wednesday, something felt wrong. Mason had just finished setting the corner tables, placing the usual vase of daisies by Grace's favorite window seat, when he realized her chair remained empty. He glanced at the old clock above the counter, 7:30. Grace was never late. His hand paused mid-wipe on the countertop. Maybe she had an appointment she forgot to mention. Maybe she overslept. But deep down, Mason knew better. As the minutes stretched into hours, Mason couldn't shake the tight knot twisting in his chest. He told himself not to worry. After all, life sometimes got in the way. Still, every time the diner bell jingled, his heart leapt, only to fall again when it wasn't Grace stepping through the door. The regulars noticed too. Mrs. Jenkins, who always sat 2 booths down, leaned over and asked, "Where's Grace this morning?" Mason could only offer a weak smile and a vague, "I'm sure she's fine." But the words tasted hollow. That day, the coffee seemed a little more bitter, the laughter a little thinner, and just as Mason was closing up for the afternoon, wiping down Grace's still empty table one last time, he spotted something out of place. Sitting right there, tucked carefully under the little vase of daisies, was a small, neatly folded note, and beside it, a single key. Mason's heart skipped. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the paper, suddenly aware that whatever he was about to read would change everything. The diner buzz faded away. In that moment, it was just him, the note, and a question so heavy it rooted him to the floor. What had happened to Grace? And why had she left him the key? Mason stood frozen, the note and key trembling slightly in his hand. Around him, the low hum of Maplewood Diner carried on, coffee brewing, dishes clinking, conversations swirling. But for Mason, the world had narrowed to the folded piece of paper he had just found. With his heart pounding, he slipped the note into his apron pocket and tucked the key safely inside, his mind already racing. He finished closing duties in a daze, offering automatic smiles and quick goodbyes, but his mind was miles away. As soon as the last light in the diner flickered off, Mason hurried to his beat-up Ford pickup, the evening air crisp against his skin. He sat for a moment under the cracked windshield, staring at the key in his hand. It was old and worn, attached to a tiny brass tag stamped simply, 12 Willow Lane. The address made his stomach twist with recognition. Grace had mentioned it once in passing, a little yellow house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac where she had lived since her husband returned from the war. It had been her world, her safe harbor after years of battles both abroad and at home. Mason drove in silence, the streets of Willow Creek blurring past under the dusky purple sky. When he pulled up to 12 Willow Lane, he immediately recognized the house. 2-story, with a sloping porch and faded white shutters. The porch light was on, casting a warm, lonely glow. He hesitated at the curb, heart thudding against his ribs. Was he even supposed to be here? Was it a mistake? But something inside him, maybe the trust Grace had always placed in him, urged him forward. The key turned easily in the lock. The door swung open with a soft groan, and Mason stepped into a home that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. The living room was cozy, filled with photographs of a life well lived. Wedding pictures, military medals, snapshots of a younger Grace laughing beside a tall, broad-shouldered man Mason assumed was her late husband. On the coffee table, resting atop a crocheted doily, was another envelope with his name written carefully across the front. Hands trembling, Mason tore it open. "Dear Mason, if you're reading this, It means I couldn't make it back to the diner to tell you in person. Don't worry, I'm still fighting, but life has a way of sneaking up on us. I want you to know, you have been my family. You brought laughter into my days when loneliness crept in. You cared when you didn't have to. This house, it's my thank you. I have no children to leave it to, and no regrets. I want you to live here, build memories here. Let your family fill these rooms with life again. Please don't feel guilty. It's what I want most. Take care of yourself, Mason. And when you sit on the porch swing in the evening, know that somewhere I'll be smiling. With love and gratitude, Grace. Mason pressed the letter to his chest, his eyes blurring with tears. He lowered himself onto the worn floral couch, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her gift and the depth of her trust. All the little conversations they had shared came rushing back. Grace telling him about her late-night knitting marathons, her stubborn battle to mow her own lawn at 80, her favorite songs from the 40s, her laughter when he teased her about switching to decaf, her fierce independence, and the moments, rare and precious, when she let her guard down to reveal the softer fears underneath. He realized now that Grace had been preparing for this all along. She had seen something in him, a kindred spirit perhaps, or simply someone who cared enough to listen. And she had chosen him as the steward of the home she had loved for decades. That night, Mason didn't return to his tiny apartment above the laundromat. He stayed at Grace's house, sleeping on the old couch, wrapped in the familiar scent of lavender and memories. And for the first time in a long while, despite the sadness gnawing at his heart, Mason didn't feel alone. The next morning, he stood on the creaky front porch, a cup of black coffee warming his hands, and watched the sun rise over Willow Creek. It painted the world in the same soft gold as it had back at the diner. But today, everything looked different, brighter, full of possibility. Grace had given him more than a house. She had given him a new beginning. And Mason vowed, standing there in the growing light, that he would honor her gift, not just by living in the house, but by living as she had, with kindness, with courage, and with the open-hearted generosity that had made her irreplaceable. The porch swing creaked gently in the morning breeze. Mason smiled. He could almost hear her laughing. Over the next few weeks, Mason worked to honor Grace's trust in every way he could. He scrubbed, dusted, polished every corner of the house with a reverence he had never given anything before. The maple floors gleamed again under the afternoon sun. The garden, once overrun with weeds, was now blooming with tulips, daffodils, and the roses Grace had so lovingly planted years ago. Neighbors who had once exchanged polite waves now stopped by, curious about the young man who had moved into Grace's home. When Mason explained, they nodded knowingly, their faces softening. Grace always had a good eye for character, old Mrs. Whitmore from next door said, pressing a plate of warm cinnamon rolls into his hands. Despite all the work, despite the new friendships forming around him, Mason couldn't shake a heavy, persistent ache in his heart. Each evening, as he rocked gently on the porch swing, sipping his coffee, the ache grew sharper. He missed Grace, her laughter, her stubborn pride, the way her stories stitched together the forgotten pieces of a town that often seemed to move too fast. One rainy afternoon, as Mason sorted through old boxes in the attic, he found a worn journal with Grace's initials embossed in faded gold. The pages were filled with neat, sloping handwriting, entries about her late husband's letters from overseas, about the loneliness that followed, about the pride and heartbreak of serving her country. But near the end, the entries changed. They became about Mason. Mason's kindness reminds me that not all battles are fought with guns. Some are fought with patience, with laughter, with showing up day after day when no one else does. I don't have much time left, but I know I'm leaving my memories in good hands. Mason's throat tightened painfully. He closed the journal carefully, clutching it to his chest like a lifeline. The realization struck him with brutal clarity. Grace hadn't just left him a house. She had entrusted him with her legacy, the memories, the history, the pieces of a life she had fought hard to build. And Mason had been so caught up in missing her that he hadn't yet truly stepped into that role. That night, Mason made a decision. He wouldn't just live in Grace's house. He would keep her spirit alive in the town that had once nearly forgotten her. He started small. Every Sunday, Mason opened the doors of the yellow house to the community. He brewed fresh coffee, baked simple pastries, and laid Grace's old photo albums across the coffee table. Neighbors drifted in, sharing stories, some about Grace, some about themselves. They laughed over memories, cried over losses, and in those moments, the house seemed to hum with warmth and life. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. Soon, veterans from the nearby center began to visit, drawn by the open door and the steady presence of Mason's kindness. He listened to their stories the same way he had listened to Grace, without judgment, without rushing, simply offering space for them to be remembered. One chilly November morning, a young woman named Carrie approached Mason as he was setting out chairs on the porch. Tears glistened in her eyes as she handed him a small, worn photograph. "My grandfather served with Grace's husband," she said, her voice trembling. "He passed away years ago, but they wrote letters to each other. I found some of them in an old box. I thought you should have them." Mason accepted the photo with reverence. Another piece of the puzzle, another thread woven into the tapestry Grace had begun. And somehow, without him realizing it, the house at 12 Willow Lane had become more than just a home. It had become a sanctuary, a place where stories mattered, where memories found new life, where no one was forgotten. On the anniversary of Grace's passing, Mason organized a gathering at the house. Friends, neighbors, veterans, even young children who had never met Grace, all came, drawn by the quiet magic she had left behind. Under twinkling string lights, they shared laughter, songs, and tales of a woman who had lived with quiet courage and fierce love. Mason stood on the porch, heart full, feeling her presence in every smile, every tear, every note of music that drifted into the starry sky. As the evening wound down, he sat once more on the familiar swing, the journal open in his lap, the scent of fresh baked pie lingering in the cool night air. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, Grace. You gave me a home. You gave this town its heart back. I promise to keep it beating." And somewhere in the hush of the night, Mason could almost hear her whisper back, "You already have." Winter crept into Willow Creek, dressing the little town in silver frost and softening even the roughest edges with snow. Mason kept the porch swing dusted and the house warm, continuing the Sunday gatherings that had become a lifeline for so many. But as the house filled with life each week, whispers began to creep through town. Whispers Mason couldn't ignore. It started with a knock on the door one frigid afternoon. Mason opened it to find a tall, stern-faced man in a pressed suit, holding a clipboard tight against his chest. "Good afternoon," the man said crisply. "I'm Daniel Owens from Ridgeway Property Management. I'm here about the ownership of this property." Mason's stomach twisted. "Ownership?" "Grace left me the house. I have the key, her letter, everything." Daniel adjusted his glasses. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. There's a technical issue. Miss Grace Thompson had an old mortgage on file that was never officially cleared. According to our records, there's an outstanding lien on this property. Legally, it still belongs to Ridgeway Holdings." The words hit Mason like a fist to the chest. I didn't know," Mason stammered. "She never mentioned any debts. She gave me the house in good faith." Daniel's face softened just slightly, but his voice remained firm. "I'm sorry. Unless the lien is paid, we'll have to proceed with foreclosure. You have 60 days to clear the balance or vacate the premises." Mason closed the door in a daze. The walls of the house, so recently filled with laughter and warmth, now pressed in around him like a cage. That night, he sat in Grace's old rocking chair, clutching the journal he had found, searching desperately for answers. But all he found were more memories, more reminders of what he stood to lose. The amount owed wasn't astronomical by today's standards, $38,000, but to Mason it may as well have been $1 million. His savings, modest at best, barely covered his rent back when he lived over the laundromat. He certainly didn't have the means to pay off a mortgage. For a few days, Mason retreated inward. He canceled the Sunday gatherings. He barely ate. The weight of the impending loss hollowed him out, leaving only anger and grief swirling in his gut. "Maybe I was a fool," he muttered one evening, pacing the front porch under a heavy gray sky. "Maybe I had no business pretending I could carry Grace's legacy." But as the days dragged by, Small reminders began to pierce through the fog of despair. A knock on the door from Mrs. Whitmore, carrying a pot of her famous chicken soup and a quiet, steady smile. A card slipped through the mail slot from Carrie, the young woman who had given him her grandfather's letters. Inside, a simple message. "This house is a home because of you. Don't give up." And then came the gathering he hadn't planned. It was a Sunday morning when Mason, still in sweatpants and unshaven, heard the sound of shovels scraping. Curious, he pulled aside the curtain, and his breath caught. Dozens of neighbors, young, old, veterans, children, were outside shoveling the snow from his walkway, stringing up new lights on the sagging porch, clearing the gutters. Some were setting up tables. Others were hanging hand-painted signs that read, "Save 12 Willow Lane." Mason stumbled onto the porch, blinking against the bright white snow and the tears stinging his eyes. Mrs. Whitmore spotted him first. She waved him over and said, "We're not letting you lose this house, Mason." Grace wouldn't want that, and neither do we. Word had spread about the lien. Quietly, without asking for permission, the people of Willow Creek had started a fundraiser. The diner put out a collection jar. The church organized a benefit concert. Kids held bake sales. Veterans raffled off hand-carved wooden flags. Every dollar, every pie sold, every raffle ticket bought was a small act of love, stitched together into a miracle. At the heart of it all was Mason, too stunned, too humbled to do anything but say thank you over and over again. As the sun set that evening, Mason stood once more on the porch swing, now wrapped in fresh garlands. Around him, laughter rang out, fires crackled in barrels, neighbors sipped hot cocoa from mismatched mugs. He realized something Grace had understood long before he did. The house wasn't just bricks and wood. It was the people, the stories, the hands reaching out when life got too heavy. Grace had left him more than a home. She had left him a community. And this time, he wasn't going to lose it. Spring arrived early in Willow Creek that year, as if even the seasons were eager to witness something new. Thanks to the relentless kindness of the townspeople, the lien on Grace's house was paid in full by early March. Mason filed the final paperwork with trembling hands, sealing the deed officially in his name. But deep down, he knew the home had never truly belonged to just him. It belonged to all of them. He needed to find a way to thank them. Not with just words, but with something lasting, something that honored Grace's spirit and the heart of Willow Creek itself. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch swing, Mason found the answer. His gaze wandered over the overgrown side lot next to Grace's house, the patch of land she had once called her wild garden. An idea bloomed, simple and perfect. He would create a place where stories could live on, a garden built by the community, for the community, a living memory for those who had been, and a promise for those yet to come. He spent the next weeks planning feverishly, sketching ideas late into the night under the flickering kitchen light, visiting the local nursery for advice, gathering volunteers. No one hesitated when he asked for help. By mid-April, the lot buzzed with life. Veterans helped Mason build raised garden beds. Children painted colorful stepping stones. Teenagers lugged heavy bags of soil, laughing and competing to see who could carry more. Even Mr. Baxter, the gruff hardware store owner who rarely smiled, donated a brand new set of tools without a word. Every Saturday, Mason hosted garden days, where neighbors came with seedlings, shovels, and stories. Grace's favorite roses were planted along the fence line, their sweet scent mingling with fresh earth. Old Mrs. Whitmore contributed a bench she had carved by hand, its back etched with the words, "In memory and in hope." Mason worked harder than he ever had in his life. His muscles ached, his hands were constantly blistered, but his heart had never felt lighter. Finally, on a warm Sunday afternoon in May, the Willow Creek Memorial Garden was ready. Mason planned a dedication ceremony, a true celebration of everything Grace and the town had given him. That morning, he stood before the gathered crowd, nerves rattling inside him. He wasn't used to speeches. He wasn't a man of fancy words. But as he looked out at the sea of familiar faces, laugh lines, sunburned cheeks, eyes shining with pride, his fear melted away. He stepped up to the simple wooden podium, cleared his throat, and began. "I thought I was just a server at a diner," Mason said, voice thick with emotion. I thought kindness was something you offered with coffee and a smile, and that was enough. He paused, letting the silence settle gently. But Grace taught me that kindness is a seed. You plant it without knowing if it'll grow, and sometimes it blooms into something bigger than you ever imagined. He gestured to the vibrant garden behind him. Roses, sunflowers, lilacs, veterans' plaques tucked among the greenery, children's hand-painted stones peeking from the beds. This garden isn't mine, it's ours. It's every handshake, every meal shared, every time we show up for each other. Mason's voice caught as he finished. I don't know if Grace can see this, but if she can, I hope she knows. We remember, we always will. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Mrs. Whitmore started a soft applause that soon grew into a standing ovation, hearty and full of life, echoing down the quiet streets of Willow Creek. After the ceremony, people wandered through the garden, laughing, remembering, connecting. Mason watched from the porch swing, heart swelling with a bittersweet mixture of grief and gratitude. It wasn't just about saving a house anymore. It was about saving the spirit of a woman who had refused to let the world forget her. It was about saving each other in all the quiet ways that matter most. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Mason wandered into the garden, running his fingers over the rough wood of Mrs. Whitmore's bench. He sat down heavily, breathing in the scent of roses and fresh earth, feeling the pulse of life all around him. In the distance, he could hear the faint echoes of music and laughter drifting from the diner, the church, the park, places that had once seemed so ordinary but now shimmered with meaning. Mason smiled. He wasn't just keeping a promise to Grace. He was building something that would outlast them all. The seasons rolled gently through Willow Creek, each one leaving its quiet mark on the little town in the garden Mason had built. Summer brought picnics and lemonade under the old oak trees. Fall painted the garden beds in hues of gold and crimson. Winter draped everything in soft, white silence. Through it all, Mason remained the steady heartbeat of 12 Willow Lane. He still worked a few shifts at Maplewood Diner, laughing with old friends and newcomers alike. But most of his heart lived in the garden now, in the Sunday gatherings and the veterans' meetings that took place under the pergola, in the children's laughter as they chased each other along the winding paths. Sometimes Mason would sit alone on Mrs. Whitmore's bench at dusk, the journal Grace had left him resting on his lap. He would run his fingers over the worn pages, rereading her words like a prayer. Kindness isn't wasted. It grows, even when you don't see it. He understood it now in a way he hadn't before. He had planted kindness, not just through grand gestures, but through daily acts of showing up, of remembering, of caring. And like Grace had promised, it had grown into something larger than one life, one house, or even one town. One particularly cool evening, on the anniversary of Grace's birthday, Mason organized a candlelight gathering in the garden. There was no fanfare, no speeches, just a simple act of remembrance. As the sun dipped behind the hills one by one, neighbors lit candles and placed them among the flowers. The soft glow of 100 flames danced across the beds of roses and lilacs, casting long, golden shadows. Mason stood at the center, holding a candle of his own. He closed his eyes, letting the warm breeze wash over him, and whispered into the twilight, "Thank you, Grace. You gave me a life I never knew I was worthy of." When he opened his eyes, he wasn't alone. All around him stood the people of Willow Creek, faces old and young, carrying stories, memories, and hope. It was then Mason realized he hadn't just honored Grace's memory, he had become part of it. And as long as there were hands to plant seeds, voices to tell stories, and hearts willing to show up for each other, her legacy and his would never fade. The candles flickered gently in the breeze, carrying their light into the night, 1,000 tiny promises that kindness, once sown, would never truly die. In a world that often moves too fast, the story of Mason and Grace reminds us of the enduring power of kindness and human connection. Small acts of care, like sharing a conversation, offering a listening ear, or showing up for someone in need, can leave ripples that touch countless lives long after we're gone. Grace's simple but profound gift wasn't just a house. It was the seed of a legacy built on community, memory, and compassion. For those entering the later seasons of life, this story reaffirms a powerful truth. It's not wealth or status that leaves a lasting mark, but the kindness we plant in others' hearts. Mason shows that even when faced with hardship, choosing to nurture community and preserve memories can give life new meaning and joy. We are never too old or too small to make a difference. The quiet strength of connection, loyalty, and gratitude is what truly builds a life worth remembering. And often the greatest legacies are not written in stone, but in the simple, everyday acts of love we leave behind.